Hey guys, I don't usually post about this stuff, but I guess it's been a few years now, and sometimes I still get asked about the whole experience. So, yeah, here's the story of how I ended up walking on the moon. It all started like it does for a lot of kids. I was obsessed with space. I mean, like, really obsessed. I was that kid who spent hours staring up at the night sky, imagining myself out there, floating among the stars. But while other kids were talking about being astronauts, I didn't just talk about it. I did something about it. I didn't know exactly how I'd get there, but my mind was set. My name's Mark Daniels, by the way. I grew up in Ohio. Nothing glamorous, just a small town where everybody knew everyone. But my passion for space led me to studying aerospace engineering. After college, I joined the Air Force. That's where I thought my path would end, flying jets and doing training exercises. It was a great job, don't get me wrong, but it didn't scratch that itch. I wanted more. And then one day, I saw the NASA ad for astronaut applicants. At first, it felt like a pipe dream, but I wasn't going to just let it pass me by. I applied, and to my surprise, I made it to the first round of interviews. They said they'd be looking for engineers, pilots, scientists, but more importantly, people who could handle extreme pressure. That's when I knew my Air Force experience would come in handy. The selection process was insane, guys. Imagine the hardest tests you've ever had, but ramped up to a level where it's not just your skills at stake, it's your entire future. Physical fitness tests were brutal, but it wasn't just about being in shape. There were psychological tests where they'd throw you into simulations to test how you'd react under stress, how you'd perform in life-threatening situations. They even simulated spacecraft malfunctions and asked us to solve them in real time. They wanted to know, could we handle isolation? Could we keep our heads when everything was falling apart? I still remember the first time I stepped into that mock-up of a spacecraft for the first time. The air inside was dry, thick with the scent of steel and plastic. They weren't kidding around. No music, no distractions. Just a computer screen that would ping questions at you, and a clock ticking down as if your life depended on it. And I swear, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, even though I knew it was all part of the training. They kept asking me, what would you do if you were alone in space with no communication for days? It felt like an eternity. And then, the day finally came. The call from NASA. The email was a blur. Something about my qualifications, my tests, and my profile fitting what they needed for the next moon mission. It took a few minutes for it to hit me. I was going to space. I was going to be part of history. I almost couldn't believe it. I called my mom. She cried. I could hear her voice shaking on the phone. They gave me a few months of preparation, rigorous physical training, more tests, and some advanced technology training. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. The day I sat in the rocket for the first time. The launch pad was unlike anything I had ever seen. Massive. I mean, you look at rockets in pictures, but seeing one up close? It's hard to describe the scale. The whole structure looms over you like some sort of ancient beast. And the sound. Oh man, the sound was terrifying. I was sitting there, strapped into my seat, feeling every nerve in my body hum with anticipation. It wasn't just the rocket shaking. It was my bones, my muscles, every cell in my body vibrating with a raw mix of excitement and fear. When the countdown started, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't fear anymore. It was pure exhilaration. As we reached the final seconds, I felt like I was about to be launched out of reality itself. And then, boom, the engines ignited. The thrust hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt it. It wasn't just in my body, it was in my soul. My heart was pounding, but my mind went into a kind of hyperfocus. The whole world outside blurred as we ascended, and the pressure pushed me back into my seat, making it harder to breathe, to even think straight. I knew I was supposed to stay calm, but I couldn't help but feel an adrenaline rush like no other. My hands were shaking, gripping the armrests of my seat. The G-force made everything feel distant, like I wasn't even in my body anymore. It was surreal. And as we broke through the atmosphere and I saw the Earth shrinking behind me, I knew this was it. This was my dream coming true. There's something about seeing the Earth from space, guys. It doesn't hit you immediately. You're too busy keeping your cool, making sure everything's working, that your brain just registers it slowly. But when you finally see it, the Earth, this tiny blue marble hanging in the vastness of space, it takes your breath away. There's nothing like it. I stared at it through the porthole, completely awestruck. The colors of the oceans, the clouds, and the landmasses were so vibrant and alive. And I realized just how small we all are, just how precious this planet is. This was it. I was in space. The first few days in space were a blur, honestly. Everything was new, unlike anything I'd ever experienced on Earth. Even though we'd been in simulations and training for months, nothing could truly prepare you for life in zero gravity. The first time I floated out of my seat, I was surprised at how natural it felt. It was like my body had forgotten what it was like to be tethered to the ground. My feet, those things that had always kept me anchored, felt useless. My arms flailed a little, trying to grab hold of anything, but it wasn't like the movies. There's no graceful floating around like you see in sci-fi. It's more like you're in a constant state of controlled chaos, trying to orient yourself in a world where up and down don't exist. I remember the first time I tried to eat in space. They give you these packaged meals, freeze-dried, vacuum-sealed, basically food designed to last, but also food designed to be eaten in a vacuum. I opened up a pouch of space pasta, don't get me started on the taste, and squeezed it out like some sort of toothpaste, trying not to let it float away. But even though I was starving, the idea of food floating around in front of me seemed odd, almost alien. It wasn't just the zero gravity, it was the isolation. There's a strange quietness in space. No birds, no cars, no chatter. The only sounds you hear are the hum of the spacecraft, the soft whirring of life support systems, and your own breathing through the helmet. It makes you feel like you're not just far from Earth physically, but emotionally as well. The quiet gets to you after a while. At night, when we would have a few moments to ourselves, I'd float by the windows and just stare at the stars. But it wasn't all serene. Things went wrong, and they went wrong fast. A few days in, I was performing a routine maintenance check when I noticed a slight flicker in one of the solar panels. It wasn't a big deal, but if it wasn't fixed, it could have led to a power failure later on. That's when I realized something. There's no one to help you out here. You're the only one who can make decisions. It was up to me and my crew to get it fixed. The tension in those moments was palpable. We had a backup crew member who was supposed to handle troubleshooting, but when he entered the airlock to suit up, he started feeling lightheaded. Something went wrong with his oxygen, and he couldn't get a good breath. My heart raced as I saw him sway. There's no time for panic in situations like that. We worked fast, coordinating everything from inside the ship, guiding him through the emergency protocol. It was a reminder, things could go wrong in an instant, but eventually, everything settled. It always does, after the storm. The days on the ship weren't much better. Even though I was surrounded by my fellow astronauts, people like Sarah, who was our mission commander, and Jake, the veteran engineer. They were all in their own worlds, dealing with their own isolation. It wasn't like we could just hang out at a bar or play cards like we would have back home. We had a schedule, training, experiments to run. There was always something to do, but in between those moments, there was a kind of emptiness, and it wasn't the same for everyone. Sarah was always calm, always collected, but I could see the strain in her eyes. The isolation was getting to her too. One night, we were all supposed to meet in the lab to check our progress on some lunar experiments, but Sarah didn't show up. Jake went to her quarters, but she wasn't there. So, we started floating around the station, calling her name. I can't tell you how weird it is to shout someone's name when there's no sound in space. Finally, we found her near the observation window. She wasn't doing anything, just staring out into the abyss, looking at Earth. It was the only time I've ever seen her so vulnerable. She wasn't upset. She wasn't crying. She was just lost in thought. That was when it hit me. We were all alone out here. We could talk to mission control, but we were still so far away. After that, things got back to normal. We moved forward, one task at a time. But we were all different people than we were before we left Earth. We had seen what it was like to live in the void, to float through a space where nothing is familiar, where nothing's certain. The day we approached the moon was something else. If you've ever had that experience when you're traveling somewhere far away, and the destination starts to come into view, like really see it for the first time, It's that rush of reality that slaps you in the face. The moon wasn't just some distant rock anymore. It was right there, hanging in the window like an invitation. We were nearing lunar orbit, and it was like everything was happening so fast. We were preparing for the descent, but everything in my body felt like it was dragging, like my mind couldn't keep up with the sheer scale of what was happening. I kept asking myself, am I really about to land on the moon? The whole idea of it felt surreal. Even though we'd been training for months, I had seen the footage, heard the stories, but nothing could compare to the overwhelming feeling of being there, just outside of it all, looking down at the surface below. Sarah, our commander, was as cool as a cucumber. I don't know how she did it, but she kept her calm, running through the checklists, guiding us all through the final stages. Jake was running diagnostics, checking systems, and then there was me, just kind of floating there, staring at the vast expanse. The moon didn't have an atmosphere, so there was no soft blue sky, no clouds, just this dull gray surface scattered with craters. But in that moment, it was beautiful. It was the moon. The descent was nerve-wracking. As we approached the landing site, the gravity of the situation really hit me. I was about to step onto the moon, but we still had to land safely first, and that wasn't a guarantee. The entire process was automated, but there was still a part of me that was on edge. You can't help but wonder, even with all the tech, if something could go wrong. One mistake and it could all be over. But we made it. The engines fired up, and we touched down with a soft thud that reverberated through the spacecraft. The dust settled, and the lander was silent for a moment. I think we all held our breath. There it was. We had done it. I was the first one to step out. It wasn't the usual rush of adrenaline you'd expect, like running onto the stage at a concert or standing on top of a mountain. Instead, it was this quiet, surreal feeling of accomplishment mixed with awe. I remember slowly opening the hatch and stepping out onto the lunar surface. The first step was slow, deliberate, and then my boot met the ground. It wasn't like Earth's soil. The surface was dusty, fine, almost powdery. I almost lost my balance the first time, but I caught myself, grateful for the low gravity. Everything felt like it was in slow motion. I looked up at the sky, and the Earth, small, blue, and so far away, was hanging like a marble against the dark abyss. It made the enormity of the moment hit me harder. And then there was the silence. Space is quiet, but the moon? It's dead silent. There's no wind, no sound at all except for the creaking of our suits. That was the first thing I noticed. Nothing. Just me, my crew, and the surface of another world. We set up the flag and got to work. There were experiments to run, samples to collect, photographs to take. The moon was our canvas, and we were writing our names into history. It wasn't just the science that amazed me, though. It was the feeling of being there. It was hard to explain. There was no wind, no noise, no distractions, just a quiet, empty world. We were so far away from everything we knew. It wasn't scary, but it was lonely. Not in a sad way, but in a "this place was never meant for humans" kind of way. I'll never forget the moment when I walked away from the landing site, far enough to see the lander in the distance. The moon's surface stretched out before me, endless, barren, and strangely beautiful. It felt like we were part of something ancient, something bigger than ourselves. And then, things went wrong. As I was collecting a soil sample, I heard a crackling in my comms. At first, I thought it was static, but then I realized something was wrong. I tried to contact the team back at the lander, but I couldn't hear anything. Just static. My heart started to race, and I checked my suit for any damage. Was it me? Was there a breach? The silence on the moon is deafening, but the panic that started bubbling inside me was worse. I had to stay calm. I had to remember the training. I floated back toward the lander, keeping an eye on my oxygen levels and staying as composed as I could. That's when I saw Sarah. She was floating by the comm panel, frantically pressing buttons. Turns out, we had a communications glitch. One of the systems had failed, but we got it fixed pretty quickly. Still, that moment, when we were cut off from everything, was a wake-up call. It was a reminder that no matter how much training we had, no matter how much we planned, there were still unknowns out there. Space doesn't care about plans. But once that was sorted, everything was fine. We finished the mission, packed up, and made our way back to the lander for the return trip. Leaving the moon was bittersweet. I remember staring out of the small window of the lander as we ascended, the lunar surface shrinking below us. The vast emptiness of space stretched out ahead, but the moon, my destination, felt oddly comforting now, like a place that had welcomed us even though we weren't meant to be there. The trip back to the spacecraft wasn't as dramatic as the descent. The launch from the moon's surface was smooth, almost too smooth. It's hard to explain, but it felt like we were floating through the most unnatural thing, calm. After the intensity of the landing, and then the brief scare with the communications glitch, I was expecting more turbulence. But the quiet vacuum of space had its own eerie stillness, even in the midst of motion. As we docked with the main spacecraft in lunar orbit, I felt a strange sense of relief. We were heading home. I had the samples in hand, the evidence of what we'd done, and it felt final. But then, just as we were securing everything for the trip back, Sarah stopped by my station. She looked at me with this serious, almost distant expression. I could see she was thinking deeply about something. "You ever wonder," she said quietly, "if we've made a mistake?" I was caught off guard. It wasn't like Sarah to ask those kinds of questions. She was always the strong one, the one who had everything figured out. But there was something in her eyes in that moment, something I hadn't seen before. It made me think for a second. Had we made a mistake? We were about to leave the moon, the place we had fought to reach, and head back to Earth. But now that I was looking at it from her perspective, I realized something. It wasn't just the moon we were leaving behind. It was this other world, the silence, the vastness, a place so different from Earth, where everything felt foreign. But then the thought passed. This was why we were here. We were explorers. If we didn't go, who would? And so, the return journey began. The trip back to Earth wasn't the high-speed thrill ride you might imagine, but more of a slow and steady process. We spent days in the spacecraft, drifting through space, the Earth growing larger and larger in the porthole. There was a sense of anticipation. I think all of us were ready to return to gravity, to see our families again. But it wasn't just that. There was a deep, unspoken connection to our home planet that we had never fully appreciated until we left it. As we re-entered Earth's atmosphere, I felt a mixture of relief and awe. The heat shield on the capsule started glowing red, and I could feel the friction as we sped through the layers of the atmosphere. The G-forces were back, pushing us down into our seats, but it felt different this time. This time, it was like the planet was pulling us back, welcoming us home. The re-entry wasn't as smooth as the takeoff, but the moment we hit the final layer of the atmosphere, there was a sudden, jarring calm. The choppy turbulence stopped, and we descended into the lower atmosphere, ready for our splashdown in the ocean. I remember thinking, this is it, we're really going home. As we splashed down, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The capsule bobbed in the water, the engine shut down, and the moment of calm after the chaos was almost peaceful. Then came the helicopter, hovering overhead. As the recovery team lowered the ropes to pull us out of the capsule, I heard a shout from the crew. We did it. We made it back. We were finally home. When we were pulled from the capsule and placed on the recovery ship, I felt the weight of gravity again. The same gravity I'd taken for granted for so many years. But it didn't feel like the same Earth gravity anymore. It was stronger, more real, and it hit me hard after a month of weightlessness. As I stood there on the deck, feeling the familiar pressure on my legs, the reality of what we had just done began to settle in. The return to Earth was like nothing I had ever imagined. It wasn't just the scientific achievement that was celebrated. It was the way the world seemed to pause and look up at the stars. I'd never been a hero in anyone's eyes, but now, it felt like the world had changed its view of me. The cheers, the applause, the reporters and cameras, it all felt surreal. I didn't want to be the hero. I just wanted to be the guy who went to the moon and came back. But suddenly, I was the face of something much bigger. The press conferences began almost immediately. I didn't know how to deal with it. The world's eyes were on us. Sarah, Jake, and I were all taken to separate stages, given our moment to speak. But the questions never seemed to stop. What was it like on the moon? How did you feel when you saw Earth from space? What was your greatest challenge? The questions piled up, one after another. I answered them all, but inside, I was still trying to process everything that had happened. But amidst all the noise, I felt a strange emptiness. Don't get me wrong, I was proud of what we had done, proud of the mission, of the crew. But after experiencing something as life-changing as stepping on the moon, how do you return to normal life? The months following the mission were a blur. There were interviews, ceremonial events, meetings with politicians, and even visits to schools where kids asked me about space, about the moon. I signed autographs and posed for pictures, but none of it felt quite real. It felt like I was living in someone else's dream. What no one told me was how hard it would be to adjust. I had seen the stars, had felt the emptiness of space, had touched the surface of the moon. And then I came back to the mundane, the noise, the crowds. It was after one of these public appearances, standing in front of a giant flag with a fake smile plastered on my face, that I had a moment of clarity. I realized that the part of me that had touched the moon would never truly be the same. No matter how many medals they pinned on me or how many times my story was told, it wouldn't compare to the feeling of standing alone on the surface of another world. And maybe that's what made us explorers. We left a part of ourselves up there, on the moon. It's not something you can come back and share with the world. The quiet, the solitude, the awe, it's something that belongs only to you. But the hardest part? Coming back to the people I loved. When I looked at my family and friends, I realized they didn't know what it was like. They couldn't possibly understand what it meant to see Earth from the void, or what it was like to stand on the moon. The distance between us had grown, not because of anything they'd done, but because of what I had experienced. How could I explain it to them? How could I explain the feeling of stepping out onto a world that wasn't mine? In the end, it wasn't about the medals or the fame. It was about the fact that I had seen something no one else had. I had gone beyond the horizon, touched the infinite, and returned home. As the years went on, I became a bit of a symbol, part of the legacy of space exploration. But when I think back on that journey, it's not the accolades or the recognition that I remember most. It's the small moments, the quiet, dark expanse of space, the way Earth looked like a marble in the distance, the weightlessness of being alone out there, the endless beauty of the stars twinkling in the silent void. It was a moment in time that changed everything, and I was lucky enough to live it.